On today's episode of Locked On Canadiens, we have a full mailbag for you. And one of the questions is, are the Canadiens the gold standard for rebuilds in the National Hockey League?
You're Locked On Canadiens, your daily podcast on the Montreal Canadiens, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome into episode 1266 of Locked On Canadiens. Thanks for making us your first listen of the day and for subscribing wherever you get your podcast. Doing that supports the show and ensures you do not miss an episode. We are part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, 5 days a week, wherever you get your podcast. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, FanDuel customers can get $200 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. My name is Ian Boisvert, also known as @MaybeIt'sIan, and I'm joined, as I always am, by Laura Saba, also known as the Active Stick. Laura, it's the end of the week, long week for us. We have to empty the tank. We're going to be off for a few days because of the weekend. Are you ready to empty the tank on this rebuild, on this mailbag? We owe it to our friends and our listeners to do this.
Absolutely do. They stuck with us through some late games. And I'm honestly we got some really good questions. I always love our listeners for that. Sometimes a Thursday night rolls around and I just get reminded of how great you guys all are.
Yeah, smartest listeners in hockey, that's for sure. Let's do this one first from Francis Tardif on Bluesky, who asks, what's your takeaway from last week? Which I think is a perfectly great question to start with, considering this last week was all over the place for the Montreal Canadiens. They were as really high highs, really low lows. They ended up, I think, 500 on the week. I think they picked up 4 points.
Picked up 4 out of 8 points.
Yeah, so that's. It's so funny that they played really well, they played really poorly, and the result is right in the middle. How are you feeling after that week?
I honestly I think this is just evidence that the Canadiens are not quite ready for prime time, which does not mean anything other than, this is not the contending core roster that we're expecting to see, right? There a lot of the problems were a little bit of bursts of they're a little bit of lack of creativity in some points, not playing 60 minutes, a little bit of immaturity. So all of those things, those are things that the Canadiens are going to continue to work on. I think they should still be pushing to stay in the mix and hopefully try to grab a playoff spot. But I really think that, there's been a lot of discourse about the Canadiens not improving much. And I just want to ask those people, are you watching the same people we're watching? Because for me, you can't say the Canadiens are not improved over the last 2 years. You simply cannot, right? Just because, they didn't turn instantly into a Stanley Cup contender does not mean that they're not doing a lot of things well. It does not mean that players individually are not growing. And I think this week was kind of a microcosm of that, because there were growing pains, but there were also really, solid points of success. So my takeaway from the last week is the Canadiens are not ready for prime time, but that they're moving forward.
Yeah. My takeaway is that the Canadiens have an elite top line. If you've listened to us this week, if you are an everydayer with us at Locked On Canadiens, you'll know that we went in hard on that first line being elite, because it is. It's just one of the best lines in the National Hockey League. Feels weird to say that about a team that's on the bubble, but one of those other lines that's one of the elite lines in the league right now is Crosby, Rust, and Raquel, and that's not a playoff team in Pittsburgh. So you can have an elite line on a bubble team because the Canadiens up front lack, a lot of strong secondary scoring. They're going to have more double-digit goal scorers than just about anybody else in the league this year, but it still feels kind of thin in that department. In that, yes, they're double-digit, but it's 11 and 12 and 13, right? It's not a bunch of 20 goal scorers. I think their defense has generally taken a lot of steps forward, but they are missing one of their best, if not their best, defensive defenseman in Caden Gooley. It's a massive loss that we can't overstate when talking about how this team has played, into the stretch run. We don't know if or when they're getting him back. I'd like to see him play again this year, just because I think it would give that team a morale boost to see him come back, because that means, okay, we're still in a race here for the playoffs. Look, the goal of the season is to be in the mix. They are 1 point out of a playoff spot. They are in the mix. To me, that's what the week is. They continue to be right there with all of those teams, keeping pace with everybody else that they're fighting with. They have not fallen out of it. The Islanders have kind of fallen back a little bit. The Flyers are gone. Pittsburgh's gone. There's I think the Canadiens have just as much of a chance as anybody else in that cluster of making it. And this week is part of the reason why they keep picking up points, even in games where maybe they haven't earned them. And, sometimes they end up not picking up points when they probably should. Like in that Calgary game, I think they probably earned a point. But that's the way hockey goes sometimes.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. Let's move on to Charles Westcott, who we must issue a formal apology because this question came in a long time ago. And thank you, Charles, for pushing back on us and making sure we saw this, because I think this is a great question. I heard a local sports outlet ask, where the heck did Montreal come from all of a sudden? I never hear that about Canadian teams, even the Toronto Laughs. Great Barb. But to hear the Habs mentioned is truly special. My totally unbiased question is, could this Montreal rebuild become the gold standard for other clubs in the future? What's your gut reaction to that?
I think that there's a lot to work with there, but we just have to be careful not to call it until they prove that they're not going to be another Buffalo or another Ottawa or another, one of those
Yeah.
teams. Simply because the fact that we like the way that they're drafting and we like the way that they're developing doesn't necessarily mean, because we're not there yet, that they actually have, put together the right formula for actual contending and a window, right? Because we don't just want to see this flash in the pan one playoff run. We want to see them every year being the like, oh no, we have to deal with the Canadiens in the playoffs, that kind of thing. So like from a Montreal Canadiens perspective, it should be an expectation that whatever happens during the season, that come April, the Canadiens are in the playoffs, and the expectation should be that this is going to be a team that could win the Stanley Cup. And it doesn't always work out, right? Like Carolina is one of those things where like every year it feels like someone predicts that it's their year, right? It doesn't always work out, but you don't want to be like a Buffalo. So yes, it's true that the Canadiens have made smart moves in drafting. Yes, it's true the Canadiens have done a really good job in developing, but I want to see the contention before I call it as a gold standard. But I do want to say though that the way the Canadiens treat their team is much better. And I think like that's one of the things, with the honesty, with the transparency, with what they offer, with taking care of everything holistically, including families and stuff, all of that kind of stuff, the nutrition, everything surrounding them. Like, I think that should be part of the consideration when you're considering, is this a gold standard? Like, am I a team that I want to play for, right? Like the lack of toxicity in the locker room, all of the things that we've talked about over the last couple of weeks, right? Taking care of their players, just, everything that Kent Hughes does where it's like he talks to you, right? Jake Evans, we were, they were packed up to go. He and his wife were packed up to leave. And then he ended up signing an extension. Like that, just that kind of stuff should be part of the equation when we're talking about a gold standard. Everybody should want to play here is the way that I see it.
I'm of two minds on this. I think one, it's early. It's obviously too early to say. They haven't even made the playoffs as a group yet. The Canadiens, I think I heard on the TSN broadcast, the Montreal Canadiens have never missed the playoffs 4 years in a row. And they're about to. If they don't make it this year, this will be the fourth season in a row without playoffs.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of pressure on this rebuild to get it right. And I think the Canadiens are hitting all the right notes. And I really we're big fans of what they're doing. You can see what they're building. The vision there makes sense in a way that we never really saw under past regimes, right? It wasn't something that we saw under Bergevin. It wasn't something that we saw under Pierre Gauthier of all people. So I think that to me is, I'm pumping the brakes on it a little bit, but I'm highly optimistic that this plays out. The other part of me is, and maybe this is just an opportunity for me to go on a bit of a rant about some of the mentalities that I see in the fan base, which is that, a lot of people use every slight misstep or lateral move as an opportunity to be like, see, this is why this team will never win a Stanley Cup. And I find that to be one loser mentality. Like you're already thinking about how they're going to lose games instead of how they win them. That's bad. And it's not exactly like going out on a limb to say this team will never win a Stanley Cup. That's what's most likely for every team in the sport. There's 32 teams in this league now. You have, well, I don't know the numbers on this, but like that's like what, a 3% chance of winning at any given year. Like it's, wow, you're really going out on a limb by saying they'll never win one. Like Is it going to rain tomorrow too? Do you know that? I find it really difficult to put myself in the mentality of like, this rebuild's never going to work, because it's just you're prioritizing being right over enjoying the product that's in front of you and what will be in front of you over the coming years. And I just find it really icky to think that way, and really just, I don't know. I think I said it earlier. It's prioritizing being right instead of the enjoyment of the hobby that you have, of the fandom that is in front of you. And I find it really hard to put myself in that mindset, even after 2 days of combined 7 hours of sleep. So, if I can do it today, you can do it every day. That's my thoughts on that.
The answer is 3.1%.
So, man, I was right on it. Let's go. That was so great.
I did math this time.
That's great. And I almost did in my head. I was off by 0.1, and I'm going to take that as a win. That's a big win for me. All right. We are headed into our next segment of this mailbag. And one of the things we're going to worry about is what Montreal needs out of David Reinbacher when he is at his peak. And we'll get into that in just a moment. If you're like me, mornings have to start with a good cup of coffee, but I got tired of settling for the same grocery store brands that just weren't cutting it, or the single serve pods that you get. This is why I turned to Trade. And let me tell you, this coffee is next level. Trade is the #1 specialty coffee marketplace in the US, bringing you fresh coffee from over 50 top roasters. Their experts have taste tested thousands of coffees, curating over 450 amazing roasts. Whether you're new to coffee or know exactly what you like, they'll handpick the perfect match for you. I took their quick quiz in under a minute. They matched me with a roast that was fresh, smelled incredible, and tasted even better. I was never really sure of what kind of coffee I liked. I wasn't a big coffee person for a very long time, and now I know what to look for, and Trade made that easy to get my new favorites. The subscription makes it easy because there's no more last-minute grocery store runs or settling for whatever is on the shelf. It's a regular subscription that will appear at your front door when you need coffee. Right now, if you don't love your first bag, it's fine. Trade will replace it for free until they get it just right. Trade is offering exclusively our listeners 40% off your first order at drinktrade.com/lockedonnhl. That's drinktrade, TRADE.com/lockedonnhl for 40% off your first order. drinktrade.com/lockedonnhl. This episode is also brought to you by FanDuel. March Madness is here, and FanDuel is giving you the chance to get in on the action like never before. Right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. That's 200 extra bucks to use on everything from buzzer beaters to Cinderella stories, and even who's cutting down the nets at the end of the tournament. I've got my eye on a few underdogs this year. Who doesn't? And FanDuel makes it easy to back them with spreads, totals, and game props. With tournament games happening almost every day, there's always something exciting to bet on. And if you miss opening tip-off, you can get in on some live bets as well as you watch the action unfold. The FanDuel app is simple to use, and when I win, I get paid instantly, so no waiting around. You will get paid instantly as well. So visit FanDuel.com to get in on the college hoops action all tournament long. All right, Laura, we are back, and we're going to go on a bit of a run here from listener and friend of the show, DF, who sent me a couple of questions. Let's start with a funny one here. Hab or Hab not? Should Hab or Hab not die in a fire? For those who are not familiar, that don't watch the Habber or the TSN broadcasts, sometimes during the intermission, they do a segment called Hab or Hab not, which is basically just them saying true. They say a statement, and Hab means true, and Hab not means false.
Mm-hmm.
Look, as somebody who tries to come up with creative and innovative ways to get information in front of other people and making a fool of myself in the process, I find it to be one of the laziest segments on TV. I'm not gonna lie. It's bad. It's the Hab or Hab not wordplay hardly even works. Like, does anybody know what that even means? Like, I know it's have or have not, but like that's not what they're trying to do.
Yeah. It's not even like, do the Habs have this? It's
right.
Not
Thank you. Thank you for putting that in a term that actually made sense instead of me just trying to ramble out what I meant. Yeah, I completely agree. I will say Hab on that. It should die in a fire. I'll say Hab. Are you also Hab on that, Laura?
Yeah.
Yeah. Easy.
Listen, nothing against depending on their takes, nothing against the broadcast itself.
No.
I just think that does not make any sense. I think I understand like why they're trying to be cute. And I also understand that they're trying to localize it to Montreal, right? Like this is definitely a Montreal broadcast. Like I just, it's not hitting.
No, it doesn't. And I wish they would do more to make it a Montreal broadcast. Like,
Yeah.
could we get one former Montreal Canadian on the intermission, in the press box,
Ever.
more often than not? The only one we get is Mike Johnson, and that 1 or 2 games a year where we get Sergio Momesso, and that's it. Like, we don't. And then they're like, here's Marty Biron. He's French. You guys know, you're cool with Marty Biron, right? Like, he didn't play here. It's not the same. Carlo Koliakovo never played here. He was a Toronto Maple Leaf.
All I ever think when I see him is Toronto Maple Leaf.
Yeah, it's like they're trying to make us mad. This is all a psyop to make us upset. All right. Keep continuing with DF's questions. Just how good does David Reinbacher have to be? Which I really like how broad this question is. How it's very much, we know what you're talking about when you say how good does he have to be. Yeah. The rest of that question is really for us to not be upset they passed on Michkov, because that's in reality what we're always going to be thinking of, even though we know Michkov wasn't coming here. Yes. What are your thoughts? How good does Reinbacher have to be?
Here's the thing. Like, we have to take Michkov out of that equation. And unless we do, everything he does will be a disappointment, because everything that Michkov is and everything that David Reinbacher is are two entirely different things, or two entirely different players. I think the only thing they have in common is like they play the sport with the knife shoes. That's pretty much it, right? So we can't do that comparison. So we have to like remove that out of the equation, because it can't be like, oh, well, this guy scored a goal in a timely, moment, and then David Reinbacher doesn't score that many goals, or whatever it is. I think for me, what David Reinbacher has to do is, now that we know what we have in Lane Hutson, and we know what we have in Caden Gooley, and we know what we have, for the most part, in Jaden Struble, I think what David Reinbacher has to do is he has to prove to be a viable partner to Lane Hutson. Which is, it was gimmicky when they put them together in the rookie camp, blah, blah, blah. But now we know what Lane Hutson can bring, and we also know what he can't bring. And for me, David Reinbacher has to be the person that turns Lane Hutson, or gives Lane, I shouldn't say turns, gives Lane Hutson to be the ability to be considered in the same conversation as Cale Makar.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect example. I think people like to talk about drafts as, our player needs to be better than this player they did not pick. I disagree with that mentality. Most of the time when that dichotomy is pulled up, it's because one of the players is vastly overperforming the other one. And most of the time that means the player that's being outperformed is just not fitting with the team that they're on. That's, if we're doing a root cause analysis to why we're upset, that's where you need to get to. Is not if Shane Wright outscores Juraj Slafkovsky, but Juraj Slafkovsky plays on the top line for the Montreal Canadiens and they win 4 Stanley Cups. Like, are we saying, oh man, they really messed that up, they needed to have picked Shane Wright? No, of course not, because he's played a role on this team that mattered, right? He's played a role on this team that this team saw in him when they picked him as an 18-year-old. We have to also remember the boy auction is an incredibly bad way of determining talent, because these are kids. They're children. Most of them come from the other sides of the world. It's a really tough science to get right. And I just think, like, with Reinbacher, I'm right there with you. If he is if he's a first pair defenseman with Hutson, cool. If he's a second pair defenseman, but he's a really, really good second pair defenseman, he's a big right shot defenseman. That's a guy you're not going to find elsewhere. Yeah. So I completely agree with your analysis there that if he can just become the perfect partner for X player, whether it's Hutson, whether it's Gooley, if he can become the perfect pair for one of those guys, you're laughing, because you're not going to find those guys everywhere.
And I think it's something important to note too, is that, we talked, and I talk about this all the time, is that they don't have that number one defenseman. Like, to me, this has been a glaring absence in their drafting, a glaring absence in their prospect pool, because I want a Victor Hedman guy. That's what I want, right?
Yep.
But you don't necessarily need a Victor Hedman guy if the two players that you're playing together have that chemistry and that ability, right? We saw how well, again, this is not the same level, but Jake Evans and Yoel Armia, right? They put them together and they are a unit that does so many things, right? So that if you have your defenseman, and at the same time, like when you have a core and you're expecting to contend, what you're expecting is that these guys are going to be on your roster for a few years in a row. You're not going to be trading them, right? And you're going to be hopefully be keeping them together for the same few years in a row. So that's why for me, it's like that the perfect partner analogy, not analogy, goal makes sense.
Yeah. Quick one before we end the segment, also from DF. What song embodies Brendan Gallagher? He literally couldn't answer this question himself, so I need expert opinions. Do you have a thought when you think of Brendan Gallagher? What song comes to mind? What's the soundtrack of Brendan Gallagher?
Oh, that's hard.
I have an answer.
Okay, go.
So the old MTV days, I can't say the name of the show because it would have to be bleeped, and this is a family program. Well, they would ride around in shopping carts with pumpkins on their heads to this one song, and they'd smash into stuff with reckless abandon. It was 96 Quite Bitter Beings by CKY. If you know the song, that's how Brendan Gallagher plays the game. He is putting himself into reckless abandon all the time. I just think of when he got dropped on his head in the Stanley Cup final and he's just bleeding out of the top of his head, which he should shave. He should just shave. He should just embrace the bald, Brendan.
It's time.
Yeah. Did I tap dance long enough for
Yes.
you to have an answer?
No, it's not that. It's that I like your answer because in my head I was like, what is there a song that's like about a bull in a china shop?
Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah, exactly. All right, cool. So we'll leave that there. Thank you, DF, for the questions. When we come back, we've got a bunch more questions, including one that we've kind of touched on, the balance between developing and winning, and we'll get into that in just a moment.
Ever check your bank account and wonder, where did all my money go? Between dining out, online shopping, and entertainment, it's easy to lose track. That's where Monarch Money comes in, your personal CFO giving you full visibility and control over your finances. Monarch Money isn't just a budgeting app. It's a complete financial command center. You can track all your accounts, investments, and spending in one place so you stop just managing your money and start building wealth. When I started using Monarch, I realized how much I was spending on food delivery and little things like that, and now I budget smarter and save more. Instead of juggling multiple apps, you can use Monarch to check your finances, track your spending, and even plan your long-term financial goals. Managing money with your partner is also smoother than ever. You can track shared and personal accounts, set goals, and stay on the same page without the stress, which is so important in a relationship, I find. Take control over your finances with Monarch Money. Use code LOCKEDONNHL at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. That's Monarch Money, code LOCKEDONNHL for half off your first year. This episode is also brought to you by Farm to Fork, one of the sponsors I am most excited about. If you are a fan of premium, locally farmed meats delivered straight to your door, I've got some exciting news. Farm to Fork makes it easy to get high-quality steaks, air-chilled chicken, wild-caught seafood, and more, all with no antibiotics, hormones, or GMOs. Plus, everything comes flash frozen and individually packaged for your convenience. All Farm to Fork meats are raised on Canadian farms, so when you order, you're supporting local producers. It's time to buy Canadian. Farm to Fork's meats are so delicious. I've had some amazing steaks, tender, juicy, perfectly cooked. The chicken is air chilled, and you know I've talked about it so much. I'm trying to be a protein girly on this show, and so much of my food involves chicken, and their chicken is just so good. Fresher, more flavorful than anything that you would find in the store. And the wild-caught seafood is a game changer. It's fresh, it's clean, and it's full of flavor. They're delivering all across Ontario and Western Quebec. And the best part, delivery is free with a minimum of order of $199. You don't even have to leave the house to get this kind of quality. I've got a special code just for you. Use LOCKEDON40 to get $40 off your first order at Farm to Fork. Visit farmtoforkdelivery.ca, and the two is it's a number 2, to start stocking up on the best meats around. Again, that's LOCKEDON40 at farmtoforkdelivery.ca for $40 off your first order. Farm to Fork, delicious locally farmed meats delivered straight to your door.
All right, we are back. Laura, last shifts here. We are empty the tank, dig deep. We're almost there.
We're almost at the bye week. Is that what's going on?
We're almost at the bye week. And while we're talking about this, I do want to give a shout out to the people who are at 2 a.m, 3 a.m, watching the show as it's premiering. you guys are nuts and I love you. Like, that's just incredible commitment to this bit. And as somebody who commits to way too many bits, I applaud you. So thank you for supporting us, especially in this week where, boy, it's really hard to find any time to do anything. Quick one here from Jake, because it's a rules question. I'm probably jumping the gun, but I was wondering what the rules are for late season additions to be on a team's roster. To make this concrete, let's say Jacob Fowler or Oliver Kapanen's seasons finish before the end of the Habs regular season and both immediately join the Canadiens for a few games. Assuming they are able to be on the regular season roster, if the Habs then make the playoffs, would either or both be eligible? I will say Kapanen, they've already said he's going to come and play in Laval whenever his season is over he's at Timrå over in Europe. And Fowler is an NCAA player, so they have their rule is once they sign an entry level contract, they can play regardless of whether or not it's past the deadline. Much like we saw with Lane Hudson coming in last season, playing a couple games, burning the first year of his deal, and if the Canadiens were to have made the playoffs, he would have been eligible, but they weren't, so we never got to see it. The other question you asked about was could Demidov join the team mid-playoffs? They've already said that's not going to happen, even if they go on a long run. He won't come over and play this year. So Demidov in the fall, very exciting. All right, let's head over to a question from another Jake on YouTube. Asks, how does Marty ensure that the younger players receive enough developmental opportunities while balancing the team's immediate need to perform under the pressure of securing a playoff spot? Or is playoff experience considered another part of the development process? What are your thoughts on this? We've kind of touched on this a little bit this week, but it's nice to get the thoughts into one clear point.
I think at this point in the season, every game is a new game, right? So Marty is making decisions on an in-game basis as opposed to an overall macro basis. What I mean by that is by saying, like, if benching a certain player because they're not playing all that well or reducing their minutes for any reason in the middle of a game that they're desperately trying to win and need to win, is the right choice for that night, that's what he's going to do. But next game, you start again from the beginning, right? That player gets a chance to start over. Marty was doing this last year, the year before, early this year, when there didn't seem to be all that much hope. He would allow you to continue to play in a game, even if you weren't doing all that great. He was giving you those chances, right? Which is, I think, what we mean a lot when we talk about development. But right now, it's more the fact that the playoff experience is going to be magical for a lot of these guys, just in terms of how much they're going to learn in a short amount of time. Because let's say they make the playoffs, right? They're going to be in tough, right? We're not predicting that they're going to go all the way to the end and win the whole thing. It's likely that it's going to be a single playoff series unless they pull off an upset. But that experience is going to be so valuable for the following years when they are expected to go deeper in the playoffs. So for me, like, I think that making the decisions on a game by game basis is the right thing to do, because you just reset the next game. You have another shot to prove yourself. You have another shot to earn those minutes that are going to teach you those valuable lessons. I'm rambling, but I think I got my point across.
No, totally. I think the point that you made is one we made a while ago. Learning to win is part of developing. And learning to win involves, if you're not giving it your all and I'm not able to play you and win the game, you won't play. That's a little harder to do right now, considering the Canadiens have no extras at any position. So it's more so a benching scenario. But even then, he's not really doing that. Xhekaj and Savard, who didn't play particularly well throughout the game against Seattle, they played the whole game. So yeah, I think they're doing a good job of balancing those two things. It's tough. It's really tough to ask a coach to do that. It's tough to ask a coach to worry about development because they're not wired that way, especially Marty. Marty is wired to win. That guy wants to win at all costs. That it's tough to get those guys to buy in. The fact that they've had Marty bought in on that for a long time, it just goes to show you how in lockstep he is with the front office and how they're all kind of singing from the same sheet of music. Last question from Randy Hansen: is the sudden development of Slafkovsky's game the biggest story of this second half of the season, or do you have another storyline in mind? I think second half Slav is it. I think watching him flip the switch again and become an absolute animal to play against is just really great. Yeah. The part of that story, though, that I think we're all glazing over is eventually he needs to be full season Slav and not just second half Slav. Do you have another storyline in mind? Anything else that's popping off the sheet?
Well, they're related to second half Slav, right? Like Lane Hudson, the points, Nick Suzuki's resurgence. And
Yep.
I think Nick Suzuki and Slavkovsky, the second half, like they really brought it, right? The post Four Nations break, they really brought it. They both really improved their game. The difference between those two is that with Nick Suzuki, we just expected it, right? Every time he's ever had a slump, he has to go away, have a little think, comes back hard, like twice as hard. With Slavkovsky, the question mark was, can he do what he did last year? So this is the thing, is that last year, it was the first half wasn't so great. The second half was incredible. This is really the same thing. So like you said, we do have to see if there's ever a full season. But the reason that this is a big story is that it's also enabled all those other guys to continue their run to 40 goals, or their run to point per game, or their run to, the Pistachios record, which is going to be tough. But I still have hope. I have hope.
Yeah. And look, let's throw Slavkovsky into that too. He's at 40 points after his 2-goal performance against Seattle. That puts him, he's at 40 points. He was at 50 last year. So he's 11 points away with 17 games remaining to try to beat his career high in points, which at the rate that line is going, I think he's going to get that.
Yes.
So another storyline to add. There's always reasons to watch this team this year, which has been just phenomenal coming off of the last few seasons where we're like, I don't know, maybe we'll see if Ben Sherratt pumps his trade value a little bit. Man, it's so bleak thinking about where we came from to where we are now.
Started from the bottom, now we're here. Although I shouldn't quote Drake, he's a loser.
Nah, yeah. The guy that used to be in this square would have yelled at you for making that reference, but I will let it slide. All right, Laura, we are at the last face-off here. We're going to do our trivia and then head out of here for the week with our heads held high because we did everything we needed to do this week. So stick taps to you, Laura. Yesterday's
500 week. Is that?
Yeah, exactly. Yesterday's question was about Montreal and the history of the Seattle hockey franchises, in this case, the Metropolitans. In the 1917 Stanley Cup, the Seattle captain had 14 goals in that final, and the Seattle Metropolitans beat the Montreal Canadiens in a 5-game series for the Stanley Cup. The 1919 Cup final was tied at 2-2 between Montreal and Seattle before it was ended due to the Spanish flu, because a lot of players got sick. Some of them ended up passing away. However, their captain, the Seattle captain, did not play in that 1919 series, not because he was sick, but for what reason, Laura?
He was a draft dodger, so he got arrested.
He got arrested. He was arrested for draft dodging. It's an interesting story. He was a Canadian born player who at that point would have made him a British citizen, according to the stories that I've been reading. But the U.S. law said that he needed to participate in the draft.
Because he was a resident.
He was He was a foreign national living in the United States. He did not sign up. I don't know if that was a miscommunication or he just didn't want to go, but he did get arrested right before the 1919 Stanley Cup final. He ended up serving. He was sentenced to 2 years at Alcatraz. He ended up being transferred to a military prison and then honorably discharged later on. His name was Bernie Morris, Seattle Metropolitan captain. 14 goals in a 5-game Stanley Cup playoffs series is nuts. Even by like old day standards, that's crazy.
That's some Lane Hudson numbers right there.
I like where your head's at. Super Rain had that first. Avon Post had it, but they did admit that they cheated, which I admire the honesty, which is why I'm still giving you the shout out. So congratulations to you both.
I think it's curiosity that did it, right? Like I have to know now, right? I love it.
A story that we told made somebody go and look something up. That's pretty great. Today's question: who was the first player ever traded from the Florida Panthers to the Montreal Canadiens? Montreal's playing Florida on Saturday night. Who was the first player to be ever traded from the Florida Panthers to the Montreal Canadiens? If you have the answer, put it in the comments, email it to us, yell it at us anywhere you know how. We'll shout you out on the next episode of the show. And that, mercifully, is going to do it for us this week on Locked On Canadiens. Thanks so much for tuning in this week and for all of your support as we went through the gauntlet that is the NHL season. As Marty always says, the schedule doesn't stop, and neither do we. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, and we mean every day. Thanks for making us your first listen. For your second listen, check out Locked On NHL, bringing you the daily league-wide stories that matter with local coverage you love from Locked On. Locked On NHL on YouTube, and wherever you get your podcasts. We are Locked On Canadiens everywhere you can find social posts, so come hang out with us. Instagram, TikTok, Bluesky, lockedoncanadiens@gmail.com. Continue to send in mailbag questions as the moment strikes you. We collect them, and we will try to get to them on the next episode that includes a mailbag. You can find me at Maybe It's Ian. You can find Laura at The Active Stick. Thanks so much for tuning in. Enjoy the sleep this weekend.